The letter trembled in Madeline Rose's hands, her heart shattering as she read the hastily scrawled words that destroyed the future she'd so carefully planned. In the dusty parlor of her modest Fort Laramie home, the afternoon sunlight that streamed through lace curtains suddenly felt cold and distant, much like the man who'd written the note. "Maddie," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I'll be halfway to Denver with Miss Clara Wilson. I cannot in good conscience continue with our engagement when my heart belongs elsewhere. Please forgive me." Madeline crumpled the paper in her fist, her breaths coming in short, painful gasps. 3 years of courtship, 8 months of engagement, and countless promises, all discarded for Clara Wilson, the banker's 19-year-old daughter who'd arrived in Fort Laramie just 3 months prior. At 26, Madeline wasn't old by any measure, but in William's eyes, she'd apparently become insufficient. The humiliation burned hotter than the Wyoming summer sun that beat down on the town's dusty streets. Everyone would know by sundown. In a place like Fort Laramie in 1878, news traveled faster than the stagecoach. She paced the small parlor, her mind racing with memories of William's recent behavior, his sudden disinterest, his excuses, the way his eyes had stopped meeting hers. The signs had been there, but she'd been too trusting, too devoted to notice. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Hastily wiping her tears, she smoothed her skirts and tucked a loose strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. She couldn't bear to face the town's pity just yet. "Coming," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. When she opened the door, she found Mrs. Holloway, the postmistress, standing on her porch with a sympathetic expression that told Madeline the gossip had already begun its inevitable circulation. "I just wanted to check on you, dear Mrs. Holloway said, her lined face creased with concern. "I saw William boarding the eastbound stage this morning with that Wilson girl. I couldn't believe my eyes." Madeline swallowed hard. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Holloway. I'm quite all right." The older woman's eyes narrowed skeptically. "Well, if you need anything at all, you just let me know. That man never deserved you, and that's God's honest truth." After Mrs. Holloway departed, Madeline closed the door and leaned against it, eyes closed. Her teaching position at the town school provided enough for her to live on, but the life she'd imagined with William, the home they'd planned to build, the children they'd hoped to raise, had vanished like morning mist. The following days passed in a blur of whispers and pitying glances as Madeline taught her students, shopped for necessities, and attended Sunday service with her head held high despite the hollow ache in her chest. She'd canceled the wedding arrangements with as much dignity as she could muster, returning gifts and informing guests that the October ceremony would not take place. A week after William's departure, Madeline received word that her father had fallen ill at his ranch 20 miles outside of town. Grateful for the excuse to escape Fort Laramie's suffocating gossip, she arranged for a substitute teacher and packed a small trunk for an extended stay. The journey to her father's ranch normally brought Madeline joy. The sweeping prairies, distant mountains, and sense of freedom always lifted her spirits. But today, her heart was too heavy to appreciate the landscape's beauty. The driver of the hired wagon, an elderly man who had known her since childhood, mercifully asked no questions about her broken engagement. As they approached the final stretch of road to her father's property, a summer storm rolled in with alarming speed. Dark clouds blotted out the afternoon sun, and fat raindrops began pelting the wagon. "We'd best hurry," the driver said, urging the horses to a faster pace. "Wyoming storms don't mess around." Lightning cracked across the sky, and the horses startled, veering sharply to the right. The wagon wheel caught in a rut, and before Madeline could brace herself, they were tilting precariously. "Hold on," the driver shouted, but it was too late. The wagon overturned, throwing them both clear as it crashed onto its side. Madeline landed hard, pain shooting through her ankle. The horses, still harnessed but panicked, dragged the damaged wagon several yards before stopping, trembling and snorting in the increasingly heavy rain. "Mr. Parker," she called to the driver, who lay motionless a few feet away. Ignoring the pain in her ankle, she crawled to him, relieved to find him breathing but unconscious, a gash on his forehead bleeding freely. The rain fell in earnest now, soaking through her dress and pelting her face as she tried to shield Mr. Parker. They were still at least 3 miles from her father's ranch, and no other homes stood nearby. Thunder crashed overhead, and the horses whinnied in distress. Madeline had just decided she would have to unhitch the horses and somehow get Mr. Parker onto one of them when the sound of hoofbeats approached through the curtain of rain. A tall figure on horseback emerged from the downpour, silhouetted against the stormy sky. "Hello there. Need some help?" A deep voice called out. "Yes, please," Madeline shouted over the storm. "Our wagon overturned. The driver's hurt." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion and approached quickly, leading his horse. As he came closer, Madeline could see he was a tall man with broad shoulders and a weather-worn face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. He knelt beside Mr. Parker, checking his pulse and examining the wound. "Head wound's bleeding, but doesn't look too deep. He'll have a mighty headache when he wakes, though." The stranger looked up at Madeline, revealing clear blue eyes that assessed her condition. "You hurt, madam?" "Just my ankle. I think it's only sprained." The man nodded and stood, rainwater streaming off his long, oilskin coat. "I'm Tucker Kane. Got a small place about a mile back. We need to get you both out of this weather." "I'm Madeline Rose. My father's ranch is just a few miles ahead. With this storm and your injuries, we're better off at my place for now," Tucker interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "Once the weather clears, I'll get you to your father's." Without waiting for her response, he went to the wagon, retrieved her trunk, and secured it to his horse. Then he carefully lifted the unconscious Mr. Parker and draped him over the saddle. "Can you walk?" he asked Madeline, returning to offer his hand. "I think so," but before she could finish, Tucker bent and swept her into his arms with surprising gentleness for a man of his size. "Begging your pardon, Miss Rose, but we don't have time to test that ankle. Hold onto my neck." Madeline, too startled to protest, did as he asked. He carried her as though she weighed nothing, leading his horse with the unconscious driver through the driving rain toward shelter. Tucker's small place turned out to be a well-built cabin nestled against a stand of pine trees, with a barn and corral nearby. By the time they reached it, the storm had intensified, lightning illuminating the landscape in brilliant flashes. He settled Madeline on the covered porch before retrieving Mr. Parker from the horse. Inside, the cabin was unexpectedly comfortable, clean, and orderly, with a stone fireplace, sturdy furniture, and a few personal touches that suggested permanence rather than transience. "You can take the bed," Tucker said, laying Mr. Parker on a pallet near the fire after tending to his wound. "I'll keep an eye on your driver through the night." "I couldn't possibly, madam. I don't mean to be forward, but you're soaked through, injured, and likely exhausted." "Take the bed, please." His expression softened slightly. "There's a screen in the corner for privacy. I'll bring your trunk in so you can change into something dry." Once her trunk was inside and Tucker had busied himself making coffee and stoking the fire, Madeline hobbled behind the privacy screen. She changed into a dry nightgown and wrapped herself in a quilt from her trunk, her wet hair hanging in damp tendrils down her back. When she emerged, Tucker handed her a steaming cup of coffee without comment, then knelt to examine her ankle. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her injured foot. At her nod, he gently probed the swollen area, his calloused fingers surprisingly deft. "Not broken, but it's a bad sprain. You'll need to stay off it for a few days." "I can't," Madeline protested. "My father is ill. That's why I was heading to his ranch." Tucker raised an eyebrow. "You'd be James Rose's daughter then. You know my father. Everyone within 50 miles knows James Rose." Tucker stood, towering over her. "I'll ride to your father's at first light, let him know what happened and that you're safe. Your driver should be well enough to travel by then too." Madeline studied Tucker properly for the first time. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than his current serious demeanor indicated. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard shadowed his jaw. "Why are you helping us?" she asked quietly. Tucker poured himself coffee before answering. "Out here you help folks in trouble. That's just how it is." "Well, thank you, Mr. Kane." "Tucker," he corrected. "Mr. Kane was my father, and he's been gone these 15 years. They sat in companionable silence as the storm raged outside, the occasional rumble of thunder punctuating the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Mr. Parker remained unconscious but breathing steadily, his color improving. "You should get some rest," Tucker eventually said, rising to check on the older man. "Tomorrow will sort itself out." Too exhausted to argue, Madeline retreated to the small bedroom. The bed was firm but comfortable, the sheets smelling of fresh air and pine. Despite the storm and her anxieties, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She awoke to sunlight streaming through the window and the aroma of coffee and bacon. For a moment disoriented, she forgot where she was. Then the events of the previous day rushed back: William's betrayal, the wagon accident, Tucker Kane's rescue. After dressing in a simple blue calico dress, she plaited her hair and emerged from the bedroom. Tucker stood at the stove, his back to her, while Mr. Parker sat at the table with a bandaged head, looking pale but alert. "Miss Rose," the older man exclaimed. "Thank the Lord you're all right. I was just telling Mr. Kane here that I don't remember a blessed thing after those horses spooked." "You took a nasty knock to the head," Tucker said, setting a plate of bacon and eggs before the driver. He glanced at Madeline. "How's the ankle this morning?" she tested it gingerly. "Still sore, but better." Tucker nodded and fixed a plate for her. "Sit, eat." "I'm heading to your father's place after breakfast to let him know what happened." "I'll come with you," Madeline insisted. "Not on that ankle you won't," Tucker countered. "Stay here with Mr. Parker. I'll be back by midday with news." Despite her protests, Tucker remained firm. After breakfast, he saddled his horse, a magnificent bay gelding, and rode off toward the Rose Ranch. Left alone with Mr. Parker, who dozed in his chair, Madeline explored the cabin more thoroughly. It was a bachelor's home, certainly, but not a temporary one. The furniture was solid and well made, the kitchen well stocked. Books lined one wall: history, poetry, and practical guides to ranching and horse breeding. A fine Winchester rifle hung above the door, and various tools of a rancher's trade were neatly organized on shelves and hooks. On the mantel, a single photograph caught her attention: a much younger Tucker standing beside an older man with the same strong jaw and clear eyes, both in Union Army uniforms. She hadn't considered that he might be a veteran of the war between the states. True to his word, Tucker returned shortly after noon, dismounting with the fluid grace she'd noticed the day before. "Your father sends his regards," he announced as he entered. "He's feeling much better, just a touch of fever that's passed. He's more concerned about you now." Relief washed over Madeline. "Thank goodness. Did you tell him about the accident?" "I did, and he insists you rest until that ankle's healed properly." Tucker hung his hat on a peg by the door. "He's sending one of his hands over later with some of your things. Says you're to stay put for at least a week." "A week?" Madeline exclaimed. "That's impossible. I have responsibilities in town. My students, your father already sent word to Fort Laramie. The substitute teacher will continue until you return." Tucker's expression softened at her evident frustration. "Miss Rose, your father is concerned about you, and not just because of the accident." She stiffened. "What do you mean?" "He mentioned your recent difficulties." Tucker shifted uncomfortably. "Said you might benefit from some time away from town gossip." Heat rose in Madeline's cheeks. Of course her father knew about William's betrayal, everyone did. But to discuss it with a virtual stranger— "My recent difficulties are none of your concern, Mr. Kane," she said coldly. Tucker raised his hands in a placating gesture. "You're right, and I apologize. Your father only mentioned it because he's worried. Says you've always been one to shoulder burdens alone." The accuracy of this observation deflated Madeline's indignation somewhat. "Nevertheless, I can't impose on your hospitality for a week. It's no imposition." Tucker glanced at Mr. Parker, who was watching their exchange with interest, though perhaps propriety demands a chaperone. "I'd be happy to stay, Miss Rose," the older man offered quickly. "My grandson can handle the livery for a spell." And so it was arranged that Madeline would remain at Tucker's cabin for a week, with Mr. Parker as chaperone, while her ankle healed. Her father's ranch hand arrived that evening with clothing, books, and a letter expressing his relief that she was safe and his insistence that she take time to recover both physically and emotionally. The days that followed established a routine. Tucker rose before dawn to tend his horses, which Madeline learned were his livelihood, as he bred and trained them for the cavalry at nearby Fort Laramie. He returned for breakfast, which Madeline insisted on preparing despite her injury, then worked his property until midday. Afternoons were spent on chores or riding out to check boundary lines, while evenings were passed in conversation around the fire. Mr. Parker proved an amiable chaperone, though he often dozed in his chair after supper, leaving Madeline and Tucker to talk. She learned he had fought for the Union, risen to the rank of captain, and come west after the war seeking purpose and peace. He spoke little of battles but much of the men he'd served with, and the lessons he'd learned about humanity in those dark years. In turn, she told him of growing up as the only child of a widowed rancher, of her determination to become a teacher despite the limited opportunities for women in the West, and of her love for Wyoming's wild beauty. She did not speak of William, though the pain of his betrayal lingered like a bruise beneath her ribs. On the fourth day, when her ankle had improved enough for short walks, Tucker suggested they sit on the porch to enjoy the evening breeze. Mr. Parker had retired early, complaining of a headache. "Tell me, Miss Rose," Tucker said as they watched the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson, "what will you do when you return to Fort Laramie?" Madeline sighed. "Continue teaching, I suppose. Live my life." "And that's enough for you. It has to be, doesn't it?" She twisted the empty space on her finger where her engagement ring had been. "Women have limited choices out here." Tucker was silent for a long moment. "Your father mentioned your former fiancé left town with someone else." Madeline stiffened. "Yes, a younger woman." "Then he proved himself a fool," Tucker said matter-of-factly. The simple statement, delivered without pity or sentimentality, loosened something in Madeline's chest. "Clara Wilson is very beautiful, only 19, fresh-faced and innocent." "And that's supposed to justify betrayal?" Tucker shook his head. A man who abandons his commitments for something shiny and new isn't worth your grief, Miss Rose. Madeline, she corrected softly. If I'm to stay in your home for a week, you should use my given name. Tucker's eyes met hers, something unreadable in their blue depths. Madeline, then. They sat in companionable silence as twilight deepened into night, the first stars appearing overhead. I was engaged once, Tucker said suddenly. During the war. A girl back in Pennsylvania wrote to me faithfully for 2 years. We made plans for after the fighting ended. Madeline turned to him, surprised by this confidence. What happened? I came home changed. The things I'd seen done. They left marks that don't show on the skin. His voice was low, reflective. She tried, but she couldn't understand the man who returned. We parted ways before the wedding. I'm sorry, Madeline said and meant it. Tucker shrugged. It was for the best. She married a shopkeeper, has 4 children now, lives the life she wanted. He glanced at her. The point is, sometimes what seems like heartbreak leads you where you're meant to be. The wisdom in his words resonated with something deep inside her. For the first time since reading William's letter, Madeline felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps her life wasn't ending but merely changing course. The next morning, Tucker announced he needed to deliver a horse to Fort Laramie and would be gone overnight. Madeline found herself unexpectedly disappointed at the prospect of his absence. I'll be back tomorrow afternoon, he promised as he mounted his horse, leading another by the reins. Mr. Parker knows where everything is if you need anything. After he'd gone, Madeline busied herself with baking bread and tidying the already neat cabin. Mr. Parker kept to his promise as chaperone, though he spent much of the day whittling on the porch and sharing stories of Fort Laramie's early days. That evening, as they finished a simple supper of stew and fresh bread, Mr. Parker fixed Madeline with a knowing look. He's a good man, Tucker Kane, the older man said. One of the best I've known. Madeline busied herself clearing dishes. Yes, he's been very kind to take us in. MMM. Mr. Parker's eyes twinkled. Not many bachelors out here keep a home like this. Most live like wild men, but Tucker, he's civilized. Respected too. Never raises his voice in anger, pays his debts, helps his neighbors. Mr. Parker, are you trying to tell me something? Madeline asked, amused by his transparent attempt at matchmaking. The old man chuckled. Just making conversation, Miss Rose. Just making conversation. Tucker returned the following afternoon as promised, looking weary from his journey but pleased to be home. He brought supplies from town, including a newspaper, sweets for Mr. Parker, and a novel for Madeline that she'd mentioned wanting to read. I also stopped by the school, he said as he handed her the book. Your students have made you cards wishing you well. The substitute said to tell you they miss you but are behaving themselves. Touched by his thoughtfulness, Madeline thanked him with a warmth that brought color to his tanned cheeks. That evening, after supper, Mr. Parker announced he was feeling well enough to return to town the next day. My grandson needs help at the livery and my old bones are missing my own bed. Are you certain you're recovered enough to travel? Madeline asked with concern. Fit as a fiddle, the older man assured her. Tucker can drive me in his wagon. No offense, but I've had my fill of horses for a while after that accident. Tucker agreed to take Mr. Parker to town, though he looked troubled. When the older man had retired for the night, Tucker addressed Madeline in a low voice. Without Mr. Parker here, it wouldn't be proper for you to stay alone. I'll need to find a female chaperone, or perhaps it's time you return to your father's ranch. Madeline knew he was right. A single woman couldn't stay unchaperoned in a bachelor's home without risking her reputation, but the prospect of leaving filled her with unexpected sadness. She'd grown comfortable here, in this peaceful cabin with its views of mountains and prairies, and in Tucker's steady, undemanding company. Perhaps Mrs. Holloway might come, she suggested, naming the postmistress who had shown her kindness. She's a widow with no family obligations. Tucker considered this. I'll ask her when I take Mr. Parker to town. If she's willing, I'll bring her back tomorrow. If not, I'll send word to your father to expect you. The following morning, Madeline bid farewell to Mr. Parker with genuine affection. The older man clasped her hands in his weathered ones. "Remember what I said about Tucker," he whispered with a wink. "A good man is hard to find, especially out here." After they'd gone, Madeline spent the day alone in the cabin, her ankle much improved but her heart inexplicably heavy. She tried to convince herself it was just apprehension about eventually returning to Fort Laramie and facing the gossip, but she knew it was more than that. In less than a week, Tucker Kane had become important to her. His quiet strength, his thoughtful nature, the way his rare smile transformed his serious face, all these had worked their way beneath her defenses when she least expected it. But was it merely gratitude she felt, or something deeper? Tucker returned at dusk, alone. "Mrs. Holloway sends her regrets," he said as he hung his hat by the door. "Her sister in Cheyenne has taken ill, and she leaves on tomorrow's stage to care for her." "I see," Madeline said, trying to hide her disappointment. "Then I suppose I'll need to go to my father's ranch tomorrow." Tucker nodded, his expression unreadable. "I've sent word to him already. He'll expect us mid-morning." They ate supper in uncharacteristic silence, each lost in thoughts neither seemed willing to share. Afterward, as Madeline washed the dishes, Tucker built up the fire against the evening chill. "I want to show you something before you leave tomorrow," he said suddenly. "If you're feeling up to a short walk." "Curious," Madeline agreed, and they set out into the gathering dusk. Tucker led her to a small rise behind his cabin, where a single cottonwood tree stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. "Best view in Wyoming," he said simply. And it was. The last light of day illuminated the landscape in shades of purple and gold, the distant mountains sharp against the horizon, the rolling prairie stretching endlessly before them. A hawk circled lazily overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "It's beautiful," Madeline breathed. "I come here to think," Tucker said quietly, "to remember why I chose this life." She looked up at him, his profile strong in the fading light. "And why did you? Freedom, peace, the chance to build something that's entirely my own." He turned to meet her gaze. "I came west broken by war, thinking I'd never feel whole again. But this land, it has a way of healing what's damaged if you let it." The emotion in his voice resonated with something inside Madeline. Wasn't she broken too in her own way? Betrayed and humiliated, uncertain of her future. "William left me for Clara Wilson just over 2 weeks ago," she said, the words tumbling out before she could reconsider. "We were to be married in October. Everyone in Fort Laramie knows he abandoned me for a younger woman." Tucker's expression softened. "I'm sorry for the pain he caused you, but not sorry he revealed his true character before you were bound to him for life. That's a generous way to look at it. It's the truth." Tucker hesitated, then added quietly, "Some men don't recognize the value of what they have until it's gone. Others never see it at all. Your William falls into the latter category, I suspect." "He's not my William anymore," Madeline said, surprised by how little pain accompanied the statement. They stood in silence as the first stars appeared overhead, neither moving to return to the cabin despite the growing chill. "Madeline," Tucker finally said, his voice low and serious. "I know we've known each other just a short time, but I—" He trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. Her heart quickened. "Yes, I've enjoyed having you here," he finished, though something in his expression suggested that wasn't what he'd intended to say. "The cabin has felt more like a home with you in it, Before she could respond, he straightened and cleared his throat. "We should head back. It's getting cold, and you'll need rest for tomorrow's journey." The walk back to the cabin passed in silence. The moment on the hilltop, whatever it might have been, slipping away like water through cupped hands. That night, Madeline lay awake long after retiring, listening to Tucker moving about the main room as he banked the fire and settled on his makeshift bed near the hearth. Tomorrow she would leave, returning first to her father's ranch and eventually to her life in Fort Laramie. The thought filled her with an inexplicable sadness. Had she developed feelings for Tucker Kane in just a week? Or was she merely vulnerable after William's betrayal, latching onto the first kind man who crossed her path? She didn't know, and the uncertainty kept her awake until the small hours of the morning. She rose at dawn to find Tucker already up, coffee brewing on the stove. He greeted her with his usual quiet courtesy, though she sensed a new reserve in his manner, as if he too had spent the night in troubled contemplation. They ate breakfast, packed her trunk, and prepared for departure with an efficiency that left no room for meaningful conversation. By mid-morning, Tucker's wagon was loaded and ready. As Madeline settled on the seat, Tucker hesitated before climbing up beside her. "I nearly forgot," he said, reaching into his pocket. "This came for you yesterday from Denver." He handed her a slightly crumpled envelope addressed in a familiar hand, Williams. Madeline stared at it, conflicting emotions washing over her. "You don't have to read it now," Tucker said gently, "or ever." She slipped the letter into her pocket unopened. "Thank you." The journey to her father's ranch took just over an hour, during which they spoke little. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was laden with things unsaid, opportunities missed. James Rose greeted them warmly, embracing his daughter with evident relief and thanking Tucker profusely for his care of her. "You're welcome at the Rose Ranch anytime, Kane," her father said, pumping Tucker's hand. "Any man who looks after my Maddie is a friend in my book." Tucker tipped his hat. "It was my pleasure, sir. Your daughter is—" He glanced at Madeline, something unreadable in his blue eyes. "She's quite remarkable." After Tucker had gone, promising to return Madeline's trunk once she was ready to go back to Fort Laramie, James Rose studied his daughter with knowing eyes. "That's a good man," he said simply. "So everyone keeps telling me," Madeline replied with a small smile. Her father chuckled. "And what do you think, I think?" She paused, searching for the right words. "I think I might have found something I wasn't looking for." James nodded, satisfied. "Sometimes that's how the best things in life come to us." Later that evening, alone in her childhood bedroom, Madeline finally opened William's letter. His handwriting, once so dear to her, now seemed like that of a stranger. "Dearest Madeline," he wrote, "I hope this letter finds you well. Clara and I have settled in Denver and will marry next month. I want you to know I never intended to hurt you. What happened between Clara and me was unexpected, a matter of the heart that couldn't be denied. I hope someday you can forgive me and find the happiness you deserve. Yours sincerely, William." Madeline refolded the letter, surprised by how little it affected her. 2 weeks ago, such words would have devastated her anew. Now they seemed merely self-serving. William absolving himself of guilt while pretending concern for her welfare. Tucker had been right. William had proven himself a fool, and she was better off without him. The realization brought not bitterness but relief. Something had shifted inside her during her week at Tucker's cabin, a healing she hadn't recognized until this moment. In the quiet of her room, Madeline allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd been avoiding. She had feelings for Tucker Kane. Not rebound feelings or gratitude, but genuine admiration and attraction. But what of his feelings? He'd been kind, certainly, even attentive in his quiet way. But he'd made no declarations. offered no hints of romantic interest beyond that unfinished moment on the hilltop. Perhaps she'd imagined the connection between them. Perhaps to him, she was merely a woman in need of assistance, nothing more. The next morning, Madeline Rose determined to put Tucker Kane from her mind. She would focus on regaining her strength, helping her father with ranch matters, and preparing to return to her teaching position in Fort Laramie. In time, the tender feelings she'd developed would fade, and life would continue. But fate had other plans. 3 days after her return to her father's ranch, Tucker arrived unexpectedly, riding his bay gelding with purpose. Madeline was in the kitchen garden when he appeared, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the vegetable beds. "Tucker," she said, rising from her kneeling position with surprise. "Is everything all right?" He removed his hat, revealing hair dampened with sweat from the ride. "I need to speak with you if you have a moment." "Of course." She led him to the shade of a nearby oak tree where a bench offered respite from the midday sun. "What is it?" Tucker remained standing, turning his hat in his hands with uncharacteristic nervousness. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since you left, about things I should have said but didn't." Madeline's heart quickened. "Oh, I'm not a man of many words, Madeline. The war taught me to keep my thoughts close and old habits die hard." He took a deep breath. "But I've come to realize that sometimes words need saying, even if they're imperfect." He finally met her gaze directly. "I know you're still healing from what your former fiancé did. I know it's too soon to speak of certain things. But I couldn't let you return to Fort Laramie without telling you that these past days without you have been empty." Madeline's breath caught. "Tucker, please, let me finish before my courage fails." He stepped closer. "I admire you, Madeline Rose. Your strength, your kindness, your dignity in the face of hardship. I find myself thinking of you at all hours, wondering what you might think of a sunset or a book or a new foal in my stable." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. "I'm making a mess of this. What I'm trying to say is that I'd like the chance to court you properly if you're willing. Not now, perhaps, but when you feel ready." Joy bubbled up inside Madeline, unexpected and bright. "I don't need more time." Tucker looked startled. "You don't?" "No." She rose from the bench, closing the distance between them. "William's betrayal hurt me deeply, yes. But this past week with you showed me what a true partnership might feel like, one based on mutual respect and genuine caring." Hope dawned in Tucker's blue eyes. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I'd very much like for you to court me, Tucker Kane." Madeline smiled, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. "Starting now." The smile that transformed Tucker's face made her heart skip. He took her hand gently in his calloused one. "May I call on you tomorrow, then? Perhaps take you for a ride to that view I showed you, but in daylight this time?" "I'd like that very much." They stood for a moment, hands joined, the promise of something new and precious stretching before them. Then Tucker reluctantly replaced his hat. "I should speak with your father. Ask his blessing for the courtship." "He'll give it," Madeline assured him. "He already thinks highly of you." As she watched Tucker stride toward the main house where her father would be at this hour, Madeline felt a sense of rightness settle over her. William's abandonment had seemed like an ending, but perhaps it had merely cleared the path for a better beginning. The courtship that followed over the next 3 months was unlike anything Madeline had experienced with William. Tucker called faithfully twice a week, riding the 20 miles from his property to the Rose Ranch regardless of weather. They took long rides across the Wyoming landscape, picnicked by clear streams, and spent evenings on the porch talking of books, dreams, and the future. Tucker shared more of his war experiences, the nightmares that still occasionally plagued him, and his journey west to find peace. Madeline spoke of her mother's early death, her determination to become educated despite the limited opportunities for women, and her love of teaching. In late September, Madeline returned to her teaching position in Fort Laramie, moving back into her small house in town. The gossip about William and Clara had largely died down, replaced by new speculation about her relationship with Tucker Kane, who now made weekly trips to town to escort her to dinner or church services. One crisp October evening, the very date that would have been her wedding day to William Tucker, arrived at her door with his usual punctuality but unusual formality. "I thought we might ride out to the bluffs," he suggested after greeting her with the gentle kiss that had become their custom. "The sunset should be spectacular tonight." They rode in companionable silence, Tucker occasionally pointing out a hawk or deer, Madeline enjoying the peaceful beauty of the landscape. When they reached the bluffs overlooking the North Platte River, the sky was indeed beginning to glow with the promise of a magnificent sunset. Tucker helped her dismount and spread a blanket on a flat rock overlooking the valley. From his saddlebag he produced a small picnic bread, cheese, apples, and a bottle of good wine. "This is lovely," Madeline said as they ate, watching the sun sink toward the horizon in a blaze of orange and gold. "Thank you for suggesting it." Tucker seemed uncharacteristically tense, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a nervous energy she'd rarely seen in him. He barely touched his food, his gaze frequently drifting to her face as if memorizing her features. As the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in deepening shades of purple and crimson, Tucker took her hand. "Madeline," he began, his voice husky with emotion, "I've been thinking about something you told me when we first met. You said women have limited choices out here. It struck me many times since how unfair that is, especially for someone as capable and intelligent as you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, intricately carved with a pattern of wildflowers. "I made this," he said, placing it in her hand. "Carved it myself over the past month." Madeline opened the box with trembling fingers to find a simple but beautiful gold ring set with a small, perfect diamond. "I want to give you a choice," Tucker continued earnestly. "A real one. If you choose to marry me, I promise you'll never be less than my equal partner. Your teaching, your independence, your dreams, they matter to me as much as my own." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Madeline Rose. Not for your youth or beauty, though you possess both in abundance, but for your mind, your heart, your spirit. I'll love you when we're both old and gray, when life has weathered us like it weathers these plains. I'll choose you every day for the rest of my life if you'll have me." Tears welled in Madeline's eyes. This was nothing like William's proposal, which had focused on how well they would present as a couple, the respectable life they would build. Tucker was offering something far more valuable, a love based on genuine respect and admiration, a partnership of equals. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly. "Yes, I will marry you, Tucker Kane." His face lit with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home safe, cherished, and completely right. They were married on Christmas Day, 1878, in a small ceremony at the Fort Laramie chapel. James Rose gave his daughter away with tears in his eyes, and Mrs. Holloway, returned from Cheyenne, declared it the most romantic wedding the territory had seen in years. After a brief honeymoon in Denver, where they pointedly did not seek out William and his new bride, Madeline and Tucker returned to his cabin, their cabin now. To her delight, he had expanded it during their engagement, adding a proper bedroom and a small study where she could prepare lessons and grade papers. "I want you to have your own space," he explained as he showed her the sunny room with its desk and bookshelves. Teaching is important to you, so it's important to me. Fort Laramie School Board had reluctantly agreed that Madeline could continue teaching after her marriage, an unusual arrangement, but one Tucker had firmly supported. 3 days a week, he drove her to town and picked her up after classes. The other 2 she stayed with Mrs. Holloway to avoid the daily journey. Their first year of marriage brought both joys and challenges. Tucker's nightmares occasionally returned, leaving him shaken and withdrawn until Madeline's gentle presence coaxed him back from the darkness of memory. Madeline sometimes struggled to balance her teaching duties with running a household, but Tucker never complained, instead learning to cook simple meals and taking on chores traditionally left to wives. In the spring of 1880, Madeline discovered she was expecting their first child. Tucker's reaction, dropping to his knees to press his ear against her still flat stomach, then looking up at her with wonder and tears in his eyes, confirmed what she already knew. This man would be an extraordinary father. Their son, James Tucker Kane, was born on a snowy December night with only a nervous Tucker and a capable midwife in attendance. When Tucker placed the swaddled infant in her arms, his face alight with pride and love, Madeline felt her heart might burst with happiness. "He's perfect," Tucker whispered, stroking the baby's downy head. "Just like his mother." Madeline took a leave from teaching to care for young Jamie, but by the time he was walking, she had returned to the classroom 2 days a week, often with her son in tow. The people of Fort Laramie had grown accustomed to their unconventional arrangement, some even admiring the way Tucker supported his wife's professional calling. In the summer of 1881, as Madeline sat on their porch watching Tucker teach Jamie to pet a gentle mare, a carriage appeared on the road to their property. Few visitors came unannounced, and she shaded her eyes, trying to identify the approaching vehicle. As it drew closer, she recognized with a shock the man sitting beside the driver, William. Older, more weathered, but unmistakably the man who had once been her fiancé. Tucker noticed her tension and joined her on the porch, Jamie on his hip. "Who is it?" "William," she said simply. Understanding crossed Tucker's face, followed by concern. "Do you want me to send him away?" Madeline considered this, surprised to find she felt more curiosity than distress at William's appearance. "No, I'd like to hear what he has to say." Tucker nodded, shifting Jamie to his other arm. "I'll be right here." When the carriage stopped before their home, William descended slowly, his once confident bearing diminished. He removed his hat as he approached the porch. "Madeline," he said, his voice hesitant, "you're looking well." "Hello, William." She remained seated, one hand reaching for Tucker's in a gesture of unity. "This is my husband, Tucker Kane, and our son, Jamie." William nodded to Tucker, his eyes lingering on the child. "You have a fine family." "Yes," Madeline agreed simply. "What brings you to our home?" William shifted uncomfortably. "I'm passing through on business. Heard in town you'd married and settled out here. I wanted to see for myself that you were happy." The presumption might once have angered her, but now Madeline felt only a distant pity for the man who had once featured so prominently in her plans. "I am very happy," she said truthfully. "And you? How is Clara?" A shadow crossed William's face. "Clara left me 6 months ago." "For a banker in Denver. History repeating itself, I suppose." Tucker's hand tightened around hers, but his expression remained neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that," Madeline said, and meant it. William looked at her directly for the first time. "I made a terrible mistake, Madeline. I see that now." Before she could respond, Tucker spoke up, his tone conversational but with an undercurrent of steel. "When you left Madeline for a younger woman, I told her you'd proven yourself a fool. I stand by that assessment." William flinched but didn't argue. "You're right, of course. I was a fool." He replaced his hat, preparing to leave. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, Madeline, for everything. As he turned to go, Madeline felt the last vestiges of hurt fade away. William, she called after him, I hope you find happiness someday. He paused, nodded once without turning back, and returned to the waiting carriage. They watched in silence as the vehicle disappeared down the road, Jamie babbling happily, oblivious to the significance of the encounter. Are you all right? Tucker asked quietly when the carriage was out of sight. Madeline considered the question carefully. Yes, she said finally. I think I needed that closure, though I didn't realize it until now. Tucker set Jamie down to toddle across the porch and settled beside her on the bench, his arm around her shoulders. He was right about one thing: you do look well. Motherhood and marriage suit you. She leaned into his embrace. It's not motherhood and marriage that suit me, Tucker. It's you, us, this life we've built together. No regrets, then? He asked, a hint of vulnerability in the question. Madeline turned to face him, taking in the face that had become as dear and necessary to her as breathing. Not a single one. That night, after Jamie was asleep in his crib, Madeline and Tucker sat on their hilltop under a vast canopy of stars. The encounter with William had stirred memories, but they were distant now, like scenes from a book she'd read long ago rather than chapters from her own life. I've been thinking, Tucker said, his arm warm around her in the cool evening air. Maybe it's time we expanded the cabin again. Add another bedroom. Madeline looked up at him, surprised. Are you thinking what I think you're thinking? His smile was visible even in the darkness. Jamie should have a sibling or two, don't you think? If you're willing, of course. I think that's a wonderful idea, she said, nestling closer to him. Though you might need to drive me to school more often if we have another baby. I'd drive you to the moon and back if it made you happy, Tucker said, pressing a kiss to her hair. Sitting there under the Wyoming sky, secure in her husband's embrace, Madeline reflected on the strange path that had led her to this moment. William's betrayal, once the most painful experience of her life, now seemed like a necessary detour that had guided her to where she truly belonged. In the years that followed, the Kane family grew and thrived. A daughter, Elizabeth, joined them in 1883, followed by another son, Thomas, in 1886. Tucker's horse breeding business prospered, allowing them to build a larger home on their property, though they kept the original cabin for sentimental reasons. Madeline continued teaching until 1890, when she was appointed to the Territorial Education Board, helping to shape Wyoming's school system as it transitioned to statehood. Her progressive ideas about women's education earned both criticism and praise, but Tucker's unwavering support never faltered. They weathered the hardships common to life in the West: blizzards, drought, economic downturns, with the resilience they'd both cultivated through earlier trials. Their partnership, founded on mutual respect and deepened by shared experiences, only strengthened with each passing year. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Tucker surprised Madeline by taking her back to the Bluffs where he'd proposed. Now in their 50s, with silver threading their hair and lines of experience marking their faces, they watched the sunset with the deep appreciation of those who know that beauty, like life, is fleeting and precious. You ever wonder what would have happened if William hadn't left you? Tucker asked, voicing a question he'd never before dared to ask. Madeline considered it thoughtfully. I used to in the early days of our marriage, but not anymore. She took his hand, the same strong, calloused hand that had helped her through a storm so many years ago. What we've built together is so much richer than anything I'd imagined for myself before. I think some part of me always knew that, even when my heart was breaking. Tucker nodded, understanding in his still bright blue eyes. When I told you he'd proven himself a fool, I meant it. but I've never been more grateful for another man's foolishness in my life." Madeline laughed, the sound carrying across the open prairie. "Neither have I, my love, neither have I." As twilight deepened around them, they sat in the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words to communicate their deepest feelings. Their past hurts had long ago transformed into the foundation for something stronger and more enduring than either could have built alone. William's betrayal, once a wound that seemed impossible to heal, had become merely the first step on a journey that led Madeline to the man who would love her truly, completely, for all the days of her life, not for her youth or beauty, but for the woman she was and would become. And in that knowledge, she found a happiness deeper and more abiding than she had ever dreamed possible.